The traffic stop that changed everything. Officer Marcus Thompson had been patrolling the quiet streets of Riverside County for 8 years. At 32, he was known among his colleagues as a by-the-book cop who never bent the rules no matter who was involved. His dedication to duty had earned him several commendations, but it had also made him some enemies within the department who thought he was too rigid. On that fateful Tuesday evening in September, Marcus was finishing his shift when dispatch crackled through his radio. A black sedan had been reported speeding through residential areas, running stop signs and driving erratically. The vehicle's license plate had been partially spotted by concerned citizens who called 1. Marcus immediately recognized the area. It was near the upscale Oakwood Heights neighborhood where many government officials and wealthy business people lived. As Marcus drove toward the reported location, his mind was focused on the routine traffic stop ahead. He had no idea that this single decision would completely derail his career and land him in a legal nightmare that would consume the next 2 years of his life. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets as he spotted a black sedan matching the description traveling at high speed through a school zone. Marcus immediately activated his emergency lights and sirens, expecting the driver to pull over quickly as most people did in this affluent neighborhood. Instead, the sedan continued for several more blocks, making sharp turns and appearing to try to evade the traffic stop. This behavior raised red flags for Marcus, who began to suspect he might be dealing with someone under the influence or possibly someone with warrants. When the sedan finally came to a stop in the parking lot of an upscale shopping center, Marcus approached with standard caution. The windows were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see inside the vehicle. Following department protocol for high-risk stops involving evasive behavior, Marcus drew his service weapon and took a defensive position behind his patrol car door. The driver's side window slowly rolled down, revealing a well-dressed man in his late 50s with graying hair and an expensive suit. The man's face was flushed with anger, and he immediately began shouting at Marcus before the officer could even speak. The man demanded to know why he was being stopped and insisted that Marcus was making a serious mistake. Marcus maintained his professional composure and asked the driver to step out of the vehicle with his hands visible. The man refused, instead reaching toward his jacket pocket. This movement caused Marcus to raise his weapon and loudly command the driver to show his hands. The tension in the air was thick as other shoppers in the parking lot began to notice the commotion. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. The man in the sedan slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal credentials that made Marcus's blood run cold. The gold badge and identification card clearly identified the driver as Director James Patterson, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Patterson's voice boomed across the parking lot as he demanded that Marcus lower his weapon immediately. He accused the young officer of not knowing who he was dealing with and threatened serious consequences for the outrageous treatment he was receiving. Patterson's face grew redder as he continued his verbal assault, claiming that Marcus had no authority to detain him and was interfering with federal business. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. On one hand, he was facing one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. On the other hand, his training and instincts told him that something wasn't right about the entire situation. The evasive driving, the tinted windows, and the aggressive behavior all pointed to potential criminal activity, regardless of who was behind the wheel. Despite the intimidation tactics, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He calmly informed Director Patterson that he was conducting a legitimate traffic stop based on multiple reports of erratic driving and that federal credentials did not exempt anyone from local traffic laws. Marcus requested that Patterson step out of the vehicle so they could discuss the matter properly. The FBI director's response was explosive. He began making phone calls on his cell phone, speaking to what appeared to be high-ranking officials. Marcus could hear him demanding that the incompetent local cop be dealt with immediately. Patterson threatened to have Marcus fired, arrested, and sued for harassment. The scene was becoming increasingly chaotic as curious onlookers gathered to watch the confrontation. Marcus radioed for backup, knowing that he needed witnesses and support for whatever was about to unfold. As he waited for other officers to arrive, he noticed something that made his suspicions grow even stronger. There was a strong smell of alcohol coming from the vehicle, and Director Patterson's speech seemed slightly slurred despite his aggressive tone. When backup officers arrived on the scene, they were shocked to see their colleague in a standoff with such a high-profile figure. The senior officer on duty, Sergeant Williams, approached Marcus and quietly suggested that maybe they should let the director go with just a warning. The pressure to back down was enormous, but Marcus knew that doing so would compromise everything he believed about equal justice under the law. The standoff continued for nearly 30 minutes as more police units arrived and a small crowd of spectators gathered. Director Patterson continued making phone calls, apparently to politicians and other federal officials. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and Marcus began to document everything carefully, knowing that his career might depend on having an accurate record of events. As the sun set completely and the parking lot lights came on, Marcus made another decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Despite the enormous pressure and threats, he decided to administer a field sobriety test to Director Patterson. This decision would ultimately expose a scandal that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement and forever change both men's lives. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Officer Marcus Thompson, a small-town cop with 8 years of experience, prepared to potentially arrest one of the most powerful men in American law enforcement. Nobody present could have predicted the explosive chain of events that this simple traffic stop was about to unleash. The field sobriety test that shook Washington. Marcus Thompson took a deep breath and approached Director Patterson's vehicle with the standard field sobriety test equipment. The FBI director's face had grown even redder, and his protests had become louder and more threatening. Patterson demanded to speak to Marcus's superior officer and insisted that he had diplomatic immunity from local law enforcement actions. Sergeant Williams pulled Marcus aside and whispered urgently that they should reconsider their approach. The phone calls Patterson was making were clearly reaching powerful people, and Williams worried about the political fallout for their entire department. However, Marcus pointed out that they had received multiple complaints about erratic driving, and the smell of alcohol was unmistakable. He reminded his sergeant that they had sworn an oath to uphold the law equally for everyone. The field sobriety test began with Marcus asking Director Patterson to follow a pen with his eyes while keeping his head still. Patterson's eyes showed clear signs of impairment. They couldn't track smoothly and jerked noticeably at maximum deviation. When Marcus asked him to walk in a straight line, heel to toe, Patterson stumbled twice and had to use his arms for balance. The final test, standing on one leg while counting, lasted only 8 seconds before Patterson lost his balance completely. Throughout the testing process, Patterson continued making phone calls and issuing threats. He claimed that Marcus was conducting an illegal detention and that federal agents were already on their way to intervene. Patterson's voice was becoming increasingly slurred, and his coordination was clearly impaired. Despite his high-ranking position, the evidence of intoxication was undeniable. Marcus made the decision that would change both their lives forever. He placed Director James Patterson under arrest for driving under the influence. As he read Patterson his Miranda rights, the FBI director's reaction was explosive. He screamed that this was an act of treason and that Marcus would face federal charges for interfering with national security operations. The arrest process was complicated by Patterson's continued resistance and threats. He refused to cooperate with the booking procedures and demanded to speak to the Attorney General. Marcus remained professional throughout the process, carefully documenting every step and ensuring that all proper procedures were followed. He knew that any mistake in the arrest process would be used against him later. News of the arrest spread quickly through law enforcement channels. Within hours, Marcus began receiving calls from federal agents, political officials, and media representatives. The story was too big to contain, and by morning it was headline news across the country. The image of a small-town police officer arresting the FBI director became a symbol of either heroic integrity or dangerous insubordination, depending on who was telling the story. The breathalyzer test at the station showed Director Patterson's blood alcohol content was well above the legal limit. This physical evidence should have strengthened Marcus's position, but instead it seemed to make his enemies more determined to destroy him. Federal agents arrived at the police station demanding the release of all evidence and claiming that national security was at stake. Marcus's phone rang constantly with threats, bribes, and intimidation attempts. Anonymous callers warned him that he had made a powerful enemy and that his career in law enforcement was over. Some offered him money to change his story or lose evidence. Others threatened his family's safety if he continued to pursue the case against Director Patterson. The police chief, under enormous pressure from federal officials and local politicians, called Marcus into his office. Chief Rodriguez explained that the arrest was causing problems for the entire department and suggested that maybe they could find a way to make the charges disappear quietly. The chief hinted that Marcus's career advancement would be guaranteed if he was willing to be reasonable about the situation. Marcus refused to back down. He pointed out that Director Patterson had been driving drunk through residential areas where children lived and played. The law applied to everyone equally, regardless of their position or power. Marcus's unwavering stance impressed some of his colleagues but made him powerful enemies who began plotting his downfall. The FBI launched an internal investigation, not into Director Patterson's drinking and driving, but into whether Marcus had violated federal laws by arresting a federal official. They claimed that Patterson had been engaged in classified national security work and that the arrest had compromised ongoing operations. No evidence was ever provided to support these claims, but they provided cover for what came next. Director Patterson hired the most expensive legal team money could buy. They immediately began attacking Marcus's character and qualifications. They claimed he had a history of aggressive behavior and that the arrest was motivated by a desire for publicity rather than law enforcement. These false accusations were leaked to friendly media, outlets that began portraying Marcus as a rogue cop seeking fame. The legal proceedings became a battle between a small-town police officer with limited resources and the full power of the federal government. Marcus's own department began distancing themselves from him as political pressure mounted. Fellow officers who had initially supported him started avoiding him, worried about their own careers. Marcus hired a local attorney, Sarah Chen, who specialized in civil rights cases. She immediately recognized that this case was about much more than a simple DUI arrest. It was about whether powerful officials were above the law and whether honest cops could do their jobs without fear of retaliation. Chen began building a defense based on Marcus's impeccable record and the clear evidence of Patterson's intoxication. The case attracted attention from civil rights groups and law enforcement reform advocates who saw it as a test case for police accountability and equal justice. They provided moral support and some financial assistance, but Marcus was still vastly outmatched in terms of legal resources. The stress began taking a serious toll on his family life and mental health. As the legal battle intensified, more disturbing information about Director Patterson began to surface. Other police officers came forward with stories of encounters where Patterson had used his position to avoid consequences for various infractions. A pattern of abuse of power was emerging, but these officers were quickly silenced through threats and intimidation. The media coverage became increasingly polarized. Conservative outlets portrayed Marcus as a hero standing up for law and order, while others painted him as a publicity-seeking troublemaker who had disrupted important federal operations. The truth was lost in the political battle, and Marcus found himself at the center of a national controversy he never wanted to be part of. The cover-up machine springs into action. Within 48 hours of Director Patterson's arrest, a sophisticated campaign to destroy Officer Marcus Thompson's reputation was already in motion. Federal agents began interviewing every person Marcus had ever arrested, looking for complaints or allegations of misconduct. They offered reduced sentences and favorable plea deals to criminals who were willing to make false accusations against the officer who had dared to arrest their boss. The first fabricated complaint came from a drug dealer named Tony Rodriguez, who had been arrested by Marcus 6 months earlier. Rodriguez suddenly claimed that Marcus had planted evidence during his arrest and had used excessive force. This allegation was immediately leaked to the media, even though Rodriguez had never mentioned any misconduct during his original court proceedings, and had actually praised Marcus's professionalism to other inmates. Marcus watched in horror as his 8-year career of exemplary service was systematically torn apart by lies and manufactured evidence. Internal Affairs opened an investigation based on the false complaints, and Marcus was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. This meant he couldn't work, couldn't earn his full salary, and couldn't defend himself publicly while the investigation was ongoing. Director Patterson, meanwhile, was released on his own recognizance and never spent a single night in jail. His high-powered legal team immediately filed motions to dismiss all charges, claiming that local law enforcement had no jurisdiction over federal officials engaged in national security work. They also filed a massive lawsuit against Marcus personally, demanding millions in damages for alleged civil rights violations and defamation. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility launched what they called a comprehensive review of Marcus's arrest of their director. This review was conducted entirely in secret, with no input from Marcus or his attorney. The predetermined conclusion was that Marcus had acted improperly and had potentially violated federal laws by detaining a federal official without proper authority. Marcus's attorney, Sarah Chen, tried to fight back by requesting evidence of Director Patterson's alleged national security work on the night of the arrest. The FBI claimed that all information was classified and could not be disclosed, even to a court. This convenient claim of national security privilege became their primary defense against any scrutiny of Patterson's actions or behavior. The local prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Torres, found himself caught between his oath to uphold the law and enormous political pressure to drop the charges against Patterson. Federal officials made it clear that his career advancement and his office's funding could be affected by his decision. Torres had always been an ambitious politician who dreamed of running for higher office, and taking on the FBI director was not part of his career plan. Anonymous sources began feeding damaging stories about Marcus to sympathetic reporters. These stories painted him as an unstable officer with a history of making questionable arrests. None of these claims were true, but they created a narrative that justified what was happening to him. The stories always included just enough factual details to seem credible, while distorting the truth beyond recognition. Marcus's personal life became a target as well. Federal agents visited his children's school and questioned teachers about his behavior at school events. They interviewed his neighbors, asking leading questions about whether he had ever seemed aggressive or unstable. His wife Jennifer was followed and photographed, and their family began receiving threatening phone calls at all hours of the night. The psychological warfare was taking its toll on the entire Thompson family. Marcus's teenage daughter Emma was bullied at school by classmates who had heard the false news stories about her father. His son Jake got into fights defending his dad's reputation. Jennifer considered asking for a divorce not because she doubted Marcus, but because she feared for their children's safety and future. Sarah Chen discovered that the FBI had been investigating Marcus for months before the arrest, looking for any excuse to discredit him. They had been monitoring his phone calls, following him during off-duty hours, and building a file of manufactured evidence. The arrest of Director Patterson had simply accelerated a plan that was already in motion to destroy any local law enforcement officer who might threaten federal authority. The local police union initially supported Marcus, but as federal pressure increased, their support began to waver. Union leaders were told that defending Marcus could jeopardize federal funding for local law enforcement programs. The union's legal defense fund was mysteriously audited by the IRS, and several union officials received visits from federal agents asking about completely unrelated matters. Chief Rodriguez called Marcus into his office for what would be their final conversation as colleagues. The chief explained that the department couldn't survive the federal scrutiny much longer. Politicians were threatening to cut the police budget, federal grants were being withdrawn, and other officers were being harassed by federal agents. Rodriguez suggested that Marcus might want to consider resigning quietly in exchange for a positive recommendation letter. Marcus refused to resign. He knew that doing so would be seen as an admission of guilt and would validate all the false accusations against him. More importantly, he believed that giving in to this pressure would send a message to every police officer in the country that they were powerless against federal intimidation. Someone had to take a stand, even if it meant sacrificing his own career and future. The grand jury proceedings became a farce, orchestrated by federal officials. District Attorney Torres presented the weakest possible case against Director Patterson, while simultaneously allowing federal prosecutors to present evidence against Marcus for allegedly violating Patterson's civil rights. The message was clear. The real criminal in this case was the police officer who had dared to arrest an FBI director. Marcus began receiving job offers from private security companies, presumably funded by federal sources, that would require him to relocate far from the area and sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. These offers came with the implicit promise that all charges and investigations would be dropped if he simply disappeared quietly. The temptation was enormous, especially as his legal bills mounted and his family suffered. Sarah Chen warned Marcus that they were fighting more than just a legal case. They were fighting an entire system designed to protect powerful officials from accountability. She had handled civil rights cases before, but nothing on this scale. Federal resources seemed unlimited, while they were struggling to pay for basic legal research and expert witnesses. Breaking point came when federal agents arrested Marcus's brother-in-law on completely unrelated drug charges that had been dismissed years earlier. The message was clear. Anyone associated with Marcus Thompson would become a target until he stopped fighting and accepted his fate. The systematic destruction of his life and the lives of everyone around him was just beginning. The whistleblower's dilemma. 3 months after the arrest, an unexpected ally emerged from within the FBI itself. Special Agent Lisa Martinez had been Director Patterson's personal security detail coordinator for 2 years, and she had witnessed firsthand the director's drinking problem and abuse of power. The arrest of Officer Thompson had finally pushed her to the breaking point where she could no longer remain silent. Agent Martinez knew that coming forward would end her career and possibly put her life in danger, but she couldn't stand by and watch an honest police officer be destroyed for doing his job. She had documented several incidents where Director Patterson had driven while intoxicated, used federal resources for personal matters, and intimidated local law enforcement officials who had questioned his behavior. The evidence Martinez possessed was damning. She had photographs of Patterson drinking heavily at federal events, audio recordings of him making threats against local police departments, and written reports that had been suppressed by his inner circle. Most importantly, she had documented proof that Patterson had been drinking at a federal fundraising event just hours before his arrest by Marcus Thompson. Martinez contacted Sarah Chen through an encrypted communication channel, using techniques she had learned during her counterintelligence training. The meeting between the FBI agent and the defense attorney took place in a remote location, with Martinez taking extensive precautions to avoid surveillance. She knew that if her own agency discovered her cooperation with Marcus's defense team, she would face charges of treason and espionage. The evidence Martinez provided completely changed the dynamics of the case. Her documentation showed that Director Patterson had a pattern of criminal behavior that had been covered up by federal officials for years. Local police departments across the country had been intimidated into dropping charges against Patterson, and several officers had been transferred or forced to resign after encounters with the FBI director. Sarah Chen immediately filed motions to introduce Martinez's evidence into the court proceedings. But federal prosecutors fought back with claims of national security privilege and classified information restrictions. They argued that any evidence gathered by federal agents in the course of their duties was automatically classified and could not be used in local court proceedings. Director Patterson's legal team learned of Martinez's cooperation and launched a vicious counterattack. They claimed she was a disgruntled employee who had been passed over for promotion and was seeking revenge against her superiors. Character assassination specialists were brought in to destroy Martinez's reputation, just as they had done with Marcus Thompson. The FBI's Internal Affairs Division opened an investigation into Martinez for allegedly stealing classified documents and violating her oath of secrecy. Her security clearance was immediately suspended, and she was placed under constant surveillance. Federal agents searched her home, questioned her family members, and froze her bank accounts pending the outcome of their investigation. Marcus watched with growing guilt as another person's life was destroyed because of their association with his case. Martinez had sacrificed everything to help him, and now she was facing the same systematic destruction that he had experienced. The weight of responsibility for her suffering added to his own psychological burden. The mainstream media largely ignored Martinez's revelations, focusing instead on the FBI's narrative that she was an unstable agent who had violated national security protocols. Only a few independent journalists investigated her claims seriously, but their reports were dismissed as conspiracy theories. by major news outlets that relied on federal sources for their law enforcement coverage. Marcus's family situation continued to deteriorate as the legal battle dragged on. His wife Jennifer had been forced to take a second job to pay their mounting legal bills, while their children struggled with the constant stress and public scrutiny. The family's savings were exhausted, their credit was ruined, and they were facing foreclosure on their home. The police department where Marcus had worked for 8 years officially terminated his employment, citing the ongoing federal investigation and negative publicity. Chief Rodriguez claimed that the termination was necessary to protect the department's reputation and maintain public trust in local law enforcement. Marcus lost his pension, his health insurance, and any hope of continuing his career in law enforcement. Sarah Chen discovered that federal prosecutors were offering plea deals to Marcus that would require him to publicly apologize to Director Patterson, admit that his arrest was improper, and agree never to work in law enforcement again. In exchange, all criminal charges would be dropped and the federal investigation would be closed. The offers became increasingly generous as the case attracted more public attention. Marcus faced an impossible choice. Accepting the plea deal would allow him to rebuild his life and protect his family from further harassment, but it would also validate the system of corruption and abuse that had destroyed him. Rejecting the deal meant continued legal battles, financial ruin, and the possibility of spending years in federal prison on fabricated charges. Agent Martinez, meanwhile, was fighting her own legal battle with limited resources and no support from her former colleagues. The FBI had painted her as a traitor who had violated her oath and endangered national security. Her family received death threats from anonymous sources, and she was forced to live in hiding under assumed identities. The case began attracting attention from international human rights organizations, who saw it as an example of how powerful governments could suppress dissent and punish whistleblowers. Reports were filed with the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, documenting the systematic persecution of Marcus Thompson and Lisa Martinez for their attempts to uphold the law. Congressional oversight committees began asking questions about the FBI's handling of the case, but their inquiries were stonewalled by claims of executive privilege and ongoing investigation restrictions. Several members of Congress who pressed too hard for answers found themselves under investigation by various federal agencies for completely unrelated matters. The psychological pressure on Marcus reached dangerous levels as he contemplated suicide as the only way to escape the nightmare his life had become. His family was suffering because of his decisions, his career was destroyed, and his future looked hopeless. Only the support of his attorney and a few loyal friends kept him from giving up completely. Director Patterson, meanwhile, continued his duties as FBI director as if nothing had happened. The DUI charges had been quietly dismissed by a federal judge, who ruled that local courts had no jurisdiction over federal officials engaged in national security work. Patterson's drinking problem was sent to a private rehabilitation program that operated in complete secrecy. The system had worked exactly as designed. The powerful official had been protected, the honest cop had been destroyed, and the whistleblower had been silenced. Marcus Thompson's arrest of FBI Director James Patterson was becoming a textbook example of how institutional corruption could crush anyone who dared to challenge it, regardless of how right they were. The unexpected. Turn 18 months after the arrest, a shocking development changed everything. Director Patterson was found dead in his federal office from an apparent heart attack, but the autopsy revealed lethal levels of alcohol and prescription drugs in his system. The FBI tried to keep the autopsy results secret, but Agent Martinez had allies within the medical examiner's office who leaked the information to the press. The revelation that Patterson had died from what was essentially a drug and alcohol overdose while serving as FBI director sent shockwaves through Washington. Suddenly, Marcus Thompson's arrest of the director looked less like harassment and more like a heroic attempt to get a dangerous drunk driver off the road. The narrative that had been carefully constructed to destroy Marcus began to crumble. Sarah Chen immediately filed new motions based on Patterson's death and the autopsy results. She argued that Marcus had been persecuted for doing his job correctly, and that the federal government's campaign against him had been an abuse of power designed to cover up Patterson's criminal behavior. The timing of Patterson's death from alcohol-related causes vindicated Marcus's original assessment of the director's condition. The FBI's new acting director, Robert Hayes found himself in an impossible position. He had inherited a massive cover-up that was falling apart, along with a federal agency whose reputation had been severely damaged. Hayes faced a choice between continuing the persecution of Marcus Thompson and Agent Martinez, or trying to minimize the damage by quietly ending the investigations. Media coverage began to shift as reporters realized they had been fed false information about Marcus's character and motivations. Several journalists who had written negative stories about Marcus published retractions and apologies. The narrative of a rogue cop harassing a federal official was replaced by stories about a heroic officer who had tried to stop a corrupt and dangerous FBI director. Congressional oversight committees that had been stonewalled during Patterson's tenure suddenly found themselves with cooperation from the new FBI leadership. Internal FBI documents revealed the extent of the campaign against Marcus and Martinez, including evidence of illegal surveillance, witness intimidation, and abuse of federal resources for personal vendettas. Marcus, however, was not celebrating. Patterson's death had vindicated him professionally, but it had come too late to save his career, his family's stability, or his mental health. He was still facing federal charges, still unemployed, and still struggling with the trauma of 18 months of systematic persecution. The victory felt hollow when weighed against everything he had lost. Agent Martinez emerged from hiding to testify before Congress about the culture of corruption she had witnessed within the FBI's senior leadership. Her testimony was devastating, revealing how Patterson had used his position to intimidate local law enforcement, cover up his drinking problem, and retaliate against anyone who questioned his authority. She provided documented evidence of similar cases across the country. The congressional hearings became a national sensation, broadcast live on television, and followed closely by millions of Americans. Marcus was called to testify about his experience, and his quiet dignity and obvious honesty contrasted sharply with the evasive responses from federal officials. Public opinion began to shift strongly in his favor. Sarah Chen received a call from the Justice Department offering to settle all cases against Marcus and Martinez in exchange for their agreement not to file civil rights lawsuits against the federal government. The offer included reinstatement of Marcus's law enforcement certification, full back pay, and a substantial financial settlement. However, it also included a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent them from discussing their experiences publicly. Marcus faced another difficult decision. The settlement would provide financial security for his family and allow him to potentially return to law enforcement work. However, accepting it would mean staying silent about the systematic corruption he had uncovered, potentially allowing similar abuses to continue against other officers who might challenge federal authority in the future. The local police department that had fired Marcus suddenly expressed interest in rehiring him, now that public opinion had turned in his favor. Chief Rodriguez, who had abandoned Marcus during the worst of the persecution, now claimed that the department had always supported him privately, but had been forced to take action due to federal pressure. Marcus found these overtures deeply insulting given how thoroughly he had been betrayed. Marcus's family had mixed feelings about his vindication. While they were proud that he had been proven right, the damage to their lives had been severe and permanent. His children had lost crucial years of their adolescence to stress and harassment. His wife had developed anxiety and depression that required ongoing treatment. The financial costs had been enormous and would take years to recover from. Agent Martinez faced her own difficult choices, as the FBI offered her reinstatement and promotion in exchange for her silence about what she had witnessed. She had sacrificed her career to expose corruption, and now the same agency that had persecuted her was offering to pretend that nothing had happened. The hypocrisy was stunning, but the financial reality was that she needed to work to support her family. International media coverage of the case began to focus on what it revealed about American law enforcement and the rule of law. Foreign governments and human rights organizations cited the Thompson case as evidence of systemic corruption within U.S. federal agencies. This international embarrassment added pressure on American officials to reform their practices. Marcus received job offers from police departments across the country who wanted to hire the officer who had become a symbol of integrity and courage. However, many of these offers came with the understanding that his hiring would be controversial and might attract federal scrutiny. The shadow of his experience would follow him wherever he went. The case had attracted attention from documentary filmmakers, book publishers, and movie producers who wanted to tell Marcus's story. While these opportunities offered potential financial benefits, they also meant continuing to relive the most traumatic period of his life. Marcus struggled with whether sharing his story publicly would help prevent similar abuses or simply exploit his suffering for entertainment. Sarah Chen was approached by other law enforcement officers who had faced similar retaliation for challenging federal authority. A pattern was emerging of systematic intimidation and persecution that went far beyond the Thompson case. She began considering whether to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of multiple victims of federal abuse of power. As the second anniversary of the original arrest approached, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had started as a small-town police officer who believed in the system and trusted that doing the right thing would be rewarded. He had learned harsh lessons about power, corruption, and the price of integrity in a system designed to protect those at the top. The price of justice. 2 years after Director Patterson's death, Marcus Thompson sat in a federal courthouse facing charges that should never have been filed. Despite all the evidence that had emerged about Patterson's corruption and the FBI's abuse of power, federal prosecutors were still pursuing criminal charges against Marcus for allegedly violating the former director's civil rights during the arrest. The trial had become a national spectacle, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse daily. Some carried signs calling Marcus a hero who had stood up to federal corruption. Others, organized by groups with mysterious funding, claimed he was a rogue cop who had endangered national security. The division in public opinion reflected the deeper political tensions surrounding law enforcement accountability. Marcus's legal team, now expanded to include several prominent civil rights attorneys working pro bono, presented a mountain of evidence about Patterson's drinking problem and the systematic cover-up that had followed. They showed how federal officials had manufactured evidence, intimidated witnesses, and abused their authority to punish Marcus for doing his job correctly. The prosecution's case was falling apart under scrutiny. Their key witnesses were criminals who had been offered deals in exchange for false testimony. Their claims about national security were contradicted by Patterson's own calendar, which showed he had been at a social event, not engaged in classified work, on the night of the arrest. Their character assassination attempts were undermined by Marcus's exemplary service record. Agent Martinez testified as a key witness for the defense, providing insider knowledge of how the FBI had orchestrated the campaign against Marcus. Her testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it came at enormous personal cost. She had been living under constant surveillance and threat, and her appearance in court marked the end of any hope she had of returning to a normal life. The trial revealed disturbing details about how federal agencies operated when their authority was challenged. Internal FBI communications, obtained through congressional subpoenas, showed explicit discussions about making an example of Marcus to deter other local law enforcement officers from interfering with federal officials. The contempt for local law enforcement was shocking and undeniable. Marcus's wife Jennifer took the witness stand to describe the systematic harassment their family had endured. Her testimony about the threatening phone calls, the surveillance of their children, and the financial devastation they had suffered brought several jurors to tears. The human cost of the federal government's retaliation campaign was laid bare for all to see. The prosecution's closing arguments focused on the technical aspects of Marcus's arrest authority, arguing that he had exceeded his jurisdiction by detaining a federal official. They claimed that his actions had disrupted important national security operations and set a dangerous precedent for local police challenging federal authority. Their arguments rang hollow given all the evidence that had emerged about Patterson's corruption. The defense's closing arguments painted Marcus as a symbol of everything that was right about American law enforcement, an officer who treated everyone equally under the law, regardless of their position or power. They argued that convicting Marcus would send a message to every police officer in America that they served at the pleasure of federal officials rather than the law and the Constitution. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Marcus stood as the judge asked for their decision on each charge. Not guilty on all counts, the jury foreman announced. The courtroom erupted in cheers from Marcus's supporters while federal prosecutors sat in stunned silence. After 2 years of persecution, Marcus Thompson had been completely vindicated by a jury of his peers who saw through the government's campaign of lies and intimidation. But the victory came with a bitter taste. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was approached by reporters asking how it felt to be vindicated. He struggled to find words that captured the complexity of his emotions. Yes, he had been proven right, but the cost had been devastating. His career was destroyed, his family was traumatized, and his faith in the system he had served was shattered. The federal prosecutors immediately announced their intention to appeal the verdict, showing that even a unanimous jury acquittal wouldn't end their pursuit of Marcus. Sarah Chen warned him that the government's harassment might continue for years through civil lawsuits, regulatory challenges, and other forms of legal persecution. The system had many ways to punish those who challenged its authority. Marcus received a call from the new FBI director, Robert Hayes, offering a formal apology and a substantial financial settlement in exchange for agreeing not to file a civil rights lawsuit. The offer was generous, several $1 million plus a guarantee that all federal investigations would be permanently closed. However, it came with the familiar requirement that Marcus remain silent about his experiences. The decision to accept or reject the settlement became another source of stress for Marcus and his family. The money would solve their financial problems and allow them to rebuild their lives. However, accepting it would mean abandoning Agent Martinez, who was still facing her own legal battles, and staying silent about the systematic corruption he had uncovered. Marcus chose to reject the settlement and instead filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the FBI, the Justice Department, and several individual federal officials. The lawsuit sought not only financial compensation, but also structural reforms to prevent future abuses of power. It was a decision that guaranteed years more legal battles, but offered the possibility of real change. The lawsuit attracted support from civil liberties organizations, police reform advocates, and government accountability groups who saw it as a crucial test case. Legal experts predicted that the case could reach the Supreme Court and potentially establish important precedents about the limits of federal authority and the rights of local law enforcement officers. Agent Martinez decided to join Marcus's lawsuit as a co-plaintiff, despite the risks to her own safety and future. Her insider knowledge of FBI operations was crucial to documenting the systematic nature of the abuses they had both suffered. Together, they represented the possibility that ordinary people could still hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The media coverage of the lawsuit revealed similar cases across the country where local law enforcement officers had been intimidated or persecuted for challenging federal authority. A pattern emerged of systematic abuse that went far beyond what had happened to Marcus, suggesting that his case was just the tip of a much larger iceberg of federal corruption and overreach. Marcus began receiving invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences and civil rights events about his experiences. His story resonated with police officers who had faced similar pressures to look the other way when powerful people broke the law. He became an unlikely symbol of integrity in a profession struggling with public trust and accountability issues. The personal cost of becoming a public figure was significant. Marcus's family had to live with constant security concerns, as his high profile made them targets for both supporters and opponents who took his case as a symbol of larger political battles. The children struggled with the attention and the ongoing stress of their father's legal battles. Marcus found himself caught between two worlds. He was celebrated by some as a hero of police integrity, while others saw him as a traitor who had damaged law enforcement's reputation. The complexity of public opinion reflected the deep divisions in American society about police accountability, federal authority, and the rule of law. As the civil rights lawsuit progressed through the courts, Marcus realized that his fight had become about much more than his own vindication. It was about whether ordinary citizens could hold powerful institutions accountable, whether whistleblowers could be protected from retaliation, and whether the law truly applied equally to everyone regardless of their position or power. The case had already consumed 4 years of Marcus's life and showed no signs of ending soon. Federal lawyers were using every possible delay tactic and procedural challenge to slow the proceedings, hoping to exhaust Marcus's resources and resolve. The government's unlimited legal budget gave them a significant advantage in a war of attrition that could last for many more years. The final reckoning, 5 years after that fateful traffic stop, Marcus Thompson stood before the Supreme Court of the United States as his case reached its final stage. The small-town police officer who had simply tried to do his job had become the central figure in a landmark case about federal accountability and the rule of law. The marble columns and soaring ceiling of the nation's highest court seemed to dwarf him, but Marcus had learned not to be intimidated by displays of power. The Supreme Court hearing attracted massive media attention and protesters from both sides. Civil rights advocates saw the case as crucial for establishing that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. Federal law enforcement supporters argued that the case would hamstring legitimate national security operations and encourage local interference with federal authority. Sarah Chen, now recognized as one of the country's leading civil rights attorneys, presented Marcus's case with passion and precision. She argued that the systematic persecution he had suffered represented a clear violation of his constitutional rights and established a dangerous precedent where federal officials could abuse their power without consequence. Her arguments were supported by mountains of evidence gathered over 5 years of litigation. The government's attorneys, representing an administration that was different from the one that had originally persecuted Marcus, found themselves in the awkward position of defending actions they privately acknowledged were indefensible. Their arguments focused on national security concerns and the need for federal officials to operate without fear of local interference. But their case was weakened by all the evidence of corruption and abuse that had emerged. Agent Martinez, now working as a private investigator, after being permanently blacklisted from federal employment, watched the proceedings from the gallery. Her decision to blow the whistle had cost her everything, but she drew satisfaction from seeing the case finally receive the attention it deserved. Her testimony and documentation had been crucial in exposing the systematic nature of federal abuse of power. The justices' questions during oral arguments suggested they were deeply troubled by the government's actions in the case. Even the court's most conservative members seemed disturbed by evidence that federal officials had manufactured evidence, intimidated witnesses, and used the full power of the government to destroy a police officer who had simply done his job correctly. Marcus's children, now adults, attended the hearing to support their father. The years of harassment and stress had taken their toll. His daughter had struggled with anxiety and depression, while his son had developed a deep distrust of authority that affected his ability to maintain relationships. The family had been forever changed by their ordeal. Regardless of how the case ultimately ended, the Supreme Court's decision, when it came 3 months later, was a sweeping victory for Marcus and a devastating rebuke of federal overreach. The court ruled unanimously that federal officials enjoyed no immunity from legitimate law enforcement actions and that the government's retaliation against Marcus had violated multiple constitutional provisions. The decision established important precedents that would protect other whistleblowers and honest law enforcement officers. The financial settlement that followed the Supreme Court decision was substantial. Over $50 million in damages and attorney fees. More importantly, the court ordered structural reforms within federal agencies to prevent similar abuses in the future. Congressional oversight was strengthened, and new protections were established for government employees who reported corruption. Marcus used part of his settlement to establish a foundation supporting law enforcement officers who faced retaliation for upholding their oath. The Marcus Thompson Foundation provided legal assistance, financial support, and counseling services for officers who found themselves targeted for doing their jobs with integrity. It became a beacon of hope for honest cops facing impossible situations. Agent Martinez received her own substantial settlement and formal apology from the FBI. She used her money to start a private investigation firm specializing in government corruption cases. Her insider knowledge of federal operations made her invaluable to attorneys and journalists investigating abuse of power. She had found a way to continue fighting corruption outside the system that had betrayed her. The case had broader implications beyond Marcus's personal vindication. Several high-ranking federal officials involved in the cover-up were indicted and convicted of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. The FBI implemented new policies requiring transparency in cases involving local law enforcement, and congressional oversight of federal agencies was significantly strengthened. Marcus never returned to regular police work, but he found a new calling as a trainer and consultant helping law enforcement agencies improve their accountability and integrity. His story became a case study in police academies across the country, illustrating the importance of equal justice under law and the courage required to uphold constitutional principles even under pressure. The personal costs of his fight were permanent and irreversible. Marcus's marriage to Jennifer had not survived the stress and trauma of their ordeal. They divorced amicably, but both acknowledged that the person who had returned from the legal battles was not the same man she had married. The years of persecution had changed him in fundamental ways that made normal relationships difficult. Marcus eventually remarried to Sarah Chen, his attorney who had stood by him through the darkest periods of his fight. The relationship grew from mutual respect and shared commitment to justice into something deeper. Sarah understood the trauma Marcus had experienced because she had witnessed it firsthand and had her own scars from fighting the system. 10 years after the original traffic stop, Marcus published a memoir titled, "Above the Law: My Battle with the FBI." The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a major motion picture that brought his story to an even wider audience. The royalties provided financial security, but more importantly, the book inspired other government employees to come forward with reports of corruption and abuse. Marcus's legacy extended far beyond his personal story. The Thompson Doctrine, established by the Supreme Court, became a cornerstone of civil rights law, cited in thousands of cases involving government accountability and whistleblower protection. Law schools taught courses on his case, and his name became synonymous with the principle that integrity matters more than career advancement. On quiet evenings, Marcus sometimes reflected on the simple traffic stop that had changed everything. He had been a small-town cop who believed in doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. That basic principle had cost him his original career, his first marriage, years of his life, and his peace of mind. But it had also established precedents that would protect countless others and helped restore some measure of accountability to institutions that had grown too powerful and too corrupt. The system had tried to destroy Marcus Thompson for the crime of treating everyone equally under the law. In the end, his refusal to back down had changed the system itself. It was a victory measured not just in personal vindication or financial compensation, but in the knowledge that future generations of Americans would live under a more accountable and just system of government. Sometimes Marcus realized one person really could make a difference, but the price of that difference was always higher than anyone could imagine when the fight began.